Katherine Deves joins us. Katherine, great to see you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Okay, so Katherine, we're going to talk a little transgender stuff. There's been quite a bit happening in the news, but first off, Rita mentioned earlier that, you've put your hand up for the Liberal Party. You're the sort of candidate who is brave enough. The transgender thing, for example, is the story of this little encroachment bit by bit till girls don't have their own toilets any longer, girls' sport is ruined. You are one person who has stood up relentlessly and said, save our sport, save our girls, save our women. You're the ideal candidate for the Liberal Party. What's happening?
So I can't talk to the machinations of it all, but there was a very clear clarion call that came out of Canberra this week. They are asking for more women in Parliament and more women in politics. And Warringah needs representation, and I have answered that call.
Rita.
And what has been the response from the Liberal Party, the machinery there? Have they backed you and supported you in putting up your hand?
Look, a lot of things are in play at the moment, and I'm not really in a position to answer that, I'm afraid, Rita.
See, I would like to be hearing right now, yes, they've completely supported me because I'm precisely what they've been begging for, but I'm not hearing that. It is a massive challenge. Zali Steggall took that seat. It's a seat with a changing demographic. We all know how you champion women's rights, but tell us about what other policy areas you're passionate about.
Well, look, I look at the incumbent at the moment, and they are focusing on a single issue and a subset of a single issue. And I think there are a lot more things that are in the minds of the electorate of Warringah at the moment. Everything from services for aged care and palliative care to have self-determination in retirement. We need more services for families, particularly working mothers. The biggest demographic in the Warringah electorate is working families with children. We need to look at mental health for men and for boys and for our children and adolescents, and small business with COVID recovery, superannuation, and of course, we have such a beautiful electorate. We need to make sure in relation to conservation and protecting the marine environment that we have someone who's willing to fight for that.
James?
So I want to ask you, you said that the current incumbent, Zali Steggall, is a single issue candidate. What do you say to people who would be concerned that you've got this main issue, which is around transgender women in sports, protecting women's sports, and how do you articulate, particularly for people who feel, I think, that they understand where you're coming from, but what words can you give them to say, this is why this is important? Today you had Jacqueline Maley in the Herald saying, oh, it's just, some little petty fight about bathrooms. Why is this fight so important to people and the ordinary voters out there on the streets, not just of Warringah, but around the world?
Well, this is the culture war of our time in relation to sex and gender. And as I keep articulating, we have a conflict of rights here. We have sex on the one hand and we have gender on the other. And when we have this conflict of fundamental rights, what we're seeing is that gender identity is superseding sex. And of course, that has huge ramifications across many facets of society. And it's going to be women and girls who are bearing the brunt of that. It's very obvious in sports, because when we're pitting male bodies against female bodies in the female sports competition, clearly males have the advantage. And that also leads me to Claire Chandler's bill, where she is seeking to clarify that women and girls are entitled to have a dedicated sports category. And I think when we have this issue it's feeding over into, it's affecting academia, it's affecting healthcare provision, it's affecting education, it's affecting religious rights, as we saw in Canberra. That was the hot topic, the divisive issue that caused the religious discrimination bill to be shelved. So, people might think that it's a fringe issue, but it's not, because it's impacting every aspect of society at the moment.
Well, you're right about that, Katherine, because, for example, in the UK, you mentioned healthcare. Nurses have been sacked for pointing out that they don't want transgender women, i.e. people who were men and now say that they are women, in women's wards. They don't want blokes in women's wards, no matter how that bloke thinks of himself. And they've been sacked for saying that. So women's wards in hospitals are now no longer safe for women. We've seen the story here about the Girl Guides woman who was sacked for speaking up on this transgender issue. This is ripping the guts out of, we call it the war on women on this show, and you've been on this many times talking about this, but we now see it is going to every aspect of society, and yet so few women have the courage that you have to actually stand up and say no, because they're terrified they'll get cancelled.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, as we saw in Canberra, we have real issues that we have to deal with at the moment. And if we have bureaucrats who are unwilling to even acknowledge the legal definition of sex, for instance, back in 2013, the Gillard government deliberately removed the definitions of man and woman from the Sex Discrimination Act. And, you know, we saw that manifest in the disarray in Parliament with the religious discrimination debate that happened this week. So when we pretend that biological sex doesn't exist, absolutely, we start seeing men getting into women's single-sex wards. We start seeing men taking care of our little girls at Girl Guides. And, you know, I mean, this has manifested in the UK, but it is manifesting here. And there are women who are involved in support services for females, healthcare provision for females that have been driven out of their organisations, that have been silenced, and that have been dragged through processes where they have been reprimanded and disciplined. So it is happening here, and we need to wake up to the fact that this is going on.
I want to ask you, Katherine, one of the things that we kept hearing debates about, you know, this past week and through the Religious Freedom Discrimination Bill was, oh, we need to protect trans kids. We need to protect trans kids. Now, given that so many studies have found that young people with gender identity issues, often those issues simply resolve over time, is there a danger that this focus on immediately labeling them as trans kids means that they will be put on tracks to transition where they will wind up being, I guess, pressured in a sense to continue with something that they may have decided that they don't necessarily want to go through, that this maybe we're having a huge unintended consequence in terms of protecting not just trans kids, but all kids with this debate?
Yes, that's right. So with the concept of the trans kid, I mean, we're putting labels on very young children, and childhood and adolescence is a time of identity exploration, and we shouldn't be concretising it by imposing this framework of ideology and all these terms like whether they're pangender or trans boy or trans girl. But what happens is when we put the labels on these children, the schools are on board, the medical industry is on board in getting these kids onto a medicalised pathway. And as we know that most kids resolve, the cure to distress about gender and birth sex is puberty. If we leave these children alone, they will reconcile with this once they've been through adolescence. So I think that this relentless focus on identity and sexuality with children is reckless and inappropriate. And, you know, the further to the debate with the Religious Discrimination Bill, I mean, they were talking about expelling trans kids, and I think that was a very hyperbolic take on it all. Essentially, what they were trying to do was protect single-sex schools. I mean, they're not single-gender schools. They're not kids who perform certain sex stereotypes, and that's the school that you go to. We have provision for both sexes in education. We have single-sex schools. We have toilets, camps, dormitories, and so on. And that should be delivered on the basis of sex. Now, I don't think that children should be denied education or expelled, but I think a lot of the politicians were really just not understanding the issue, and they were just seeing this as an attack on a vulnerable minority, and that really wasn't the case. But you know, further to that, I mean, this goes all the way back to Labor government meddling about with the Sex Discrimination Act and putting protected characteristics in there that really had no constitutional validity. So, I mean, the Sex Discrimination Act rests on the treaty's power, and the main treaty was to do with the protection of women and girls. biological females and to ensure that they could participate in public life free from discrimination. Now, in 2013, they inserted other protected characteristics, which were sexual orientation, intersex and gender identity. So we now have this big muddle, we have this conflict of rights, and we saw that manifest in Parliament this week.
Katherine Deves, always great to chat to you. You're a passionate warrior for women's rights. I hope Warringah selectors recognise that and recognise that the Liberal Party needs people who will fight the culture wars, seeing as the Prime Minister can't be bothered. Katherine Deves, thanks so much for speaking to us today. Always great to see you.
Thank you so much, Outsiders.